Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I have to say all three of those things because we are hosting this event to a global audience today. My name is Anthony Bubalo, and I am the CEO of Asia Society Australia, and I'll be your moderator this evening for our Global Asia Society event, exploring Asian perspectives on the US election. What makes tonight's event special is that it is a combined effort of four of Asia Society's centres: Asia Society India, Asia Society Hong Kong, Asia Society Japan, and of course here in Melbourne, Asia Society Australia. We've been joined this evening or this morning or this afternoon online by viewers across the region and indeed across the world, as well as I mentioned, a live audience here at the Asia Society headquarters in Melbourne. And we're here to talk about something that lots of people in the world are talking about. It's actually hard to say. You can debate whether this US election will be any more consequential than previous US elections. But what you can certainly say about a US election is that it captures the attention of the world like no other election. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, of course, that because of America's role and weight in the world, how America votes in November will have a material consequence for many countries around the world. But it's also true that the character and the color and the drama and the spectacle of US presidential elections also draws global attention. And certainly the current contest and the current contestants have contribute a fair share of colour and drama. And we saw both those factors at play in the first presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump this morning, or in the last 24 hours. You saw everything from a discussion about the America's standing in the world to whether American pets were safe from immigrants to America. So it had a little bit of everything. It had that the seriousness, but it also had some of the drama and the colour. So what does the forthcoming election mean for the world? What's at stake for the global community? We often hear perspectives from America and from Europe, but what does Asia think? And that's what we're here to discuss, to explore tonight. And to do that, we've assembled a terrific panel from across the region, drawing on the networks of each of our centres. So let me start introducing some of our speakers. Introducing all of our panelists. So joining us tonight to provide an Australian perspective, even though she's actually joining us from Malaysia, where she's on a research trip, is Dr. Natalie Sambhi. Natalie is a senior policy fellow here at Asia Society Australia. And because we like to provide value to our audiences, I will also be asking her tonight, not just about Australian perspectives on the election, but also about Southeast Asian perspectives. Joining us from Hong Kong is Debra Mao, an Asia-based broadcast journalist for Bloomberg TV and a former Taiwan bureau chief for Bloomberg News. From India, we have Harsh Vardhan Shringla, a distinguished former Indian diplomat who served as India's foreign secretary from 2020 to 2022 and who was previously India's ambassador to the United States. And from Japan, we are joined by Hiroyuki Akita, a commentator at the Japanese media organization Nikkei, who writes commentaries and analyses on foreign affairs and international security issues. So the way the event will work is that I will have a conversation with our panelists, ask them a series of questions. We will then provide our audience here live in Melbourne, but also our audience around the world with an opportunity to ask some questions. So for those of you online, as you're following the conversation, start sending your questions in. Obviously, we can't ask every question. We assume that there's going to be quite a few. You'll improve your chances by asking short, direct questions. Anyway, so that'll come later in today. So First of all, I'd like to welcome all the panelists. Let me start with a question to all four of you. If you had to name one or two issues that are most at stake for your country in the forthcoming US election, or in the case of Hong Kong, for Hong Kong, what would they be? Harsh, let's start with you.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me first off greet my fellow panelists, and of course our moderator, that's you, Anthony Bubalo. Greetings to all who have joined us, but I know that you're from different time zones, so I just want to say namaste to everybody. And of course, thank you to Asia Society Australia for the opportunity to provide perspectives on the US presidential election, Asian perspectives on the US presidential election. So before I answer the question, Anthony, I thought I'd just take a few seconds to put the India-US relationship in some perspective. Over the last 2 decades, the relationship has seen a transformation of the likes that I think is very rare. We've gone from what scholar, diplomat Dennis Cox calls, moving from estranged democracies to engaged democracies. So today, we and the United States are cooperating across the board on areas like trade and investment, technology, defense, robust people-to-people engagement. There's practically no US Fortune 500 company that doesn't have a presence in India. So given these synergies, it's obvious, and it is only to be expected that the US presidential election would be watched with a great amount of interest in India and perhaps a little bit of trepidation as well. Coming to what 2 issues could be of the most importance to India in the election, I would say that India would like to see a strong United States that takes a proactive and constructive role in maintaining global peace and security. In an interdependent and interlinked world, what happens, in a conflict in Europe can resonate adversely on countries across the globe, thousands of miles away, in terms of the costs of their rising costs of imports of essential food and fertilizer and fuel, but also in terms of tourism, remittances, etc., indebtedness. So I speak not just for India and our neighboring countries, but also the entire global South, when I say that we would like to see a United States that is proactively working to end conflicts in Europe, in the Middle East, and maintain global peace and security. The second issue that I think is important for us in India, and again, for the developing world on the whole, is the need for the US to focus on economic growth and stability. A stable US economy augurs well for countries across the world, whether it is in terms of controlling inflation or ensuring that currency fluctuations are minimized. So from that perspective, I think we would certainly like the US to play a responsible global role and essentially focus on global peace and security and global growth and stability. And I think these are the foremost that come to any country in the developing world or across the world. And from India's perspective, of course, a focus on issues like the Indo-Pacific is important. But then I think, broadly, those are the 2 on my wish list, Anthony.
Thanks, Harsh. Debra, I'd like to go to you in Hong Kong next. What are the 1 or 2 issues that matter for Hong Kong?
So I was saying, Anthony, I actually came prepared with very little to say about Hong Kong, but I am prepared to address concerns for the country that we're living in, and that is, giving sort of the Chinese perspective on what is happening over in the U.S. So, obviously there's a very long list of issues to choose from flashpoints in regional security to trade and economics. But I want to sort of direct people's attention to one piece of messaging that has become very clear in recent days, coming from the top leadership in China. And we saw it when Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, visited China at the end of last month. And since then, there has been further government commentary on this. But it's sort of this, what the leadership is seeing as underlying why relations are so bad right now. And that's a need for the United States to somehow achieve a better understanding of China. And part of this is China's motivations, its values, its calculations, what it wants to be in the world. We saw President Xi Jinping. This was the top point that he raised with Jake Sullivan. It was echoed by the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, Zhang Youxia, who's pretty much number two to Xi in terms of the military, that the US needs to fix what is an incorrect strategic understanding of China and return to a more rational, pragmatic policy. And then perhaps Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave the most descriptive articulation of what they mean by this incorrect understanding. And he says the US should not speculate about China based on its own experience and should not project its own model of global dominance onto China. And all of these comments were followed several days later by significant commentary in the People's Daily, which is seen to be a pretty accurate guide of what central policymakers are thinking. And again, reiterating that an accurate strategic understanding of China is the first step towards any patching up of relations. Oftentimes these sorts of comments don't get a lot of coverage in the media because it's sort of philosophical in nature, but it is significant that it is coming from the top Chinese leadership at this particular point in time, and it really signals that the government sees a very different view from the US, where any strong country would seek to dominate and form alliances, which is what the American mentality tends to be, and this desire to shape the world according to its own national interests. So China perhaps underscoring that it doesn't cover all of its motivations and interests. So coming back to the question, what's at stake here in the current election? I think China is looking for the next administration, whoever leads it, to achieve a much better understanding of China, its motivations, its thinking, and to set aside sort of these Cold War-based assumptions and to reset the narrative with more positive thinking for the future. And obviously this affects everything from issues around regional security to the trade war and industrial policy and everything in between. And secondly, I think China also is looking at being able to align with the United States in the future on issues of global significance. So things like the crisis in the Middle East, bringing Russia and Ukraine to the table for talks, and other issues, crises really, surrounding the climate and AI, which is requiring a lot of global coordination and cooperation that may not yet be where it needs to be.
Thanks. Hiro, we'll go to you next in Japan.
Thank you very much for having me. So since Mr. Trump scenario and Vice President Harris scenario are so different, so please let me share with you Japanese perspective on each scenario. So first, Trump scenario. So when Mr. Trump was the president, Japan did not suffer big shock compared to Europe, mainly because Prime Minister Abe had exceptionally good relation with Mr. Trump by frequently playing golf and also enjoying American beef hamburgers I don't know the score of their golf match, since it is still national security secret, but I'm sure that they enjoy it a lot. But Japan is aware that there is no guarantee that Japan will enjoy same success next time. So there is a strong awareness that if Mr. Trump gets elected, Japan will face paramount pressure on security and trade. But that is not the real biggest concern that Japan have. The biggest concern is that Mr. Trump may eventually strike a deal with a country like China or Russia or North Korea at the expense of Japan or other US allies, especially on China. Since Japan is facing China, Japan worries that Mr. Trump may start by imposing huge economic pressure on China. But if China will come up with a very attractive trade deal, Japan worries that Mr. Trump may take it by making a concession on Taiwan or other security issues. So that will in long run, that will destabilize Asian security situation. So that kind of the big deal between US and China over the head of Japan could be that nightmare scenario for Japan, rather than huge pressure on security burden sharing or trade. On Vice President Harris scenario, of course, we all expect that there will be a much more consistency. But it is also likely that Vice President Harris will not get satisfied only by tracing Biden foreign policy for all 4 years. So at some point, we assume that Ms. Harris will try to differentiate. And what will be the difference? My perspective is that the generational difference. Mr. Biden spent long political career during Cold War when U.S. played a critical leading role to fight against USSR. But Vice President Harris became a senator in 2016. It is 3 years after then President Obama announced that U.S. will not play the role of world policeman anymore. So lastly, even though Vice President Harris has very tough stance against Russia and also tough on China, but it may be possible that Vice President Harris will pursue more pragmatic or realistic approach especially to China, whether good or bad, being aware the limitation of U.S. State power. That is the kind of aspect that Japan will pay attention to. Thank you.
Thanks, Hiro. And finally, Natalie, a perspective from Australia. What matters from this election for Australia and also for Southeast Asia? Obviously, separate question, but we'll get both those perspectives from you.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. Look, I mean, in the first Trump administration, for the most part, the Australia-America relationship was relatively shielded from a lot of the shocks that was mentioned earlier with respect to Europe. So we've got a very strong alliance there. And we may not be so lucky the second time around with the Trump presidency. I think Australia will be also concerned about the extent to which the United States will continue to play a responsible leadership role in the Indo-Pacific. Now, ultimately, Australia is looking for the prevention of the kinds of instability that would be not conducive to economic growth, not only for itself, but to its closest neighbours as well. It's looking for a lack of preponderance of power. And so ensuring that the United States continues to play a balancing role and continues to become a good security partner and economic partner, not only for Australia, but for its partners in Southeast Asia is of critical importance. And one of the things I think underpinning the extent to which the United States has the bandwidth to be able to play that constructive Indo-Pacific role is the extent to which it has domestic stability. And when we look at increasing polarization across the United States, one also wonders the extent to which they might have a resonance effect of the kinds of issues about immigration that we're also seeing resonating in parts of Europe and the UK in places like Australia. And I say that because there have been studies that show that extreme right-wing rhetoric across American social media websites is starting to become reflected in Australian rhetoric as well. And so what we don't want is a flow-on effect, the kinds of instability that's happening domestically in the United States to start permeating our national conversation about immigration and about Australian society and our place within the region. So again, that's perhaps a minor point, but I think something that we're not paying as much attention to, and the extent to which the political circumstances of the United States not only affect Australia in a domestic sense, but perhaps also impede its ability to play that really constructive role. So I think that would be the concern of domestic issues and then a wish for the United States to continue doing what it's doing to the best of its ability. Now, if we take that from Southeast Asia's perspective, the United States has become a good security partner for many countries in the region. Indeed, it has a lot of allies as well. But if you look at the latest survey, the State of Southeast Asia, held by our colleagues in Singapore, the ISEAS think tank, of the main concerns facing Southeast Asia, elites in those countries nominated unemployment and economic recession and widening socioeconomic gaps and rising income inequality. And inevitably, Southeast Asia will be looking for opportunities, not just from Japan, South Korea, India, other partners in Australia, but certainly the United States. The extent to which Vietnam has been looking for recognition to be a different kind of a competitive economy, amongst other things, a market economy. These are the kinds of things that our region will be looking for from the United States. So indeed, I want to reiterate a point Debra made. Not only will Southeast Asia be looking for those economic opportunities, but it will also be looking to not being continually placed in a position of having to choose. The United States will often say that it's dropped rhetoric about this, pushing Southeast Asia to choose between the US and China. I would hope under whichever administration, whether it's Trump or Harris, that there is, in Debra's words, a better understanding of autonomy and agency amongst Southeast Asian states. And this is not necessarily about winning over one side or another. It's about understanding the interests that Southeast Asian states have and learning how to be not only a responsible leader, but a really constructive partner as well.
Thanks. One of the things that make the US election very vivid is obviously the coverage that is seen around the world. And it almost feels like we get to know the candidates, quite intimately. So I want to ask a question that might be a little difficult to answer, but let's have a go anyway. If your country had a vote in the election, who would they vote for? Would they vote for Trump, or would they vote for Harris? And if would the kind of the popular vote align with the desires of the government of your country? So would the government be hoping for a different candidate? Would be hoping for a similar candidate? Debra, let's start with you and talk about China. I know, difficult question, but if you had to guess, if the Chinese people got a vote, who would they vote for?
So the timing of today's panel is quite perfect because it kind of just ignited social media, of people watching this debate and weighing in with their views. So I think based on sort of the initial reactions to what we saw this morning, Harris probably came out on top. And, generally speaking, there's certainly less kind of distaste for Trump in China than there is in the United States. Not to say that, they love him, but there's, I guess, more popular kind of support for Trump than the government might signal. So social media on Trump tends to focus on his wealth, his business experience. Just recently, Barron Trump, his youngest child, going to NYU was trending. And generally speaking, the kind of pro-Trump camp in China tends to be people who enjoy that he's a realist on international affairs. Domestically, he's sort of anti-woke, tough on China, which appeals to certain liberal parts of the Chinese population. The pro-isolationism is something that appeals, and perhaps this end to U.S. moral high-handedness is sort of lecturing the world that Trump is not likely to do. So those are the things that kind of appeal to the Chinese public. On Harris, social media today saying she's younger, she was looking more, had more vitality, and she was much better at staying on topic. However, there was a lot of criticism about what's perceived as, media bias towards this candidate. So the fact that the moderators were fact-checking her, fact-checking Trump, kind of played, to her favor. And then, but overall, she kind of came out as the winner today. Interestingly, Walz, her vice presidential pick, his China experience does not seem to get very much play at all. People don't seem to care. And then on the other hand, for Harris, there is a lot of this tabloidy coverage around her personal life. So, linkages to former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, calling her, a mistress, that type of thing. And then just recently, some details about her husband, Douglas Emhoff, and his personal life. So the Chinese population is sort of all over the sordid details over there.
Thanks, Hiro. Let's go to you next. The Japanese people get a vote. Who are they voting for?
70% Harris and 30% Trump. That is my instinct. So maybe interesting part is why 30% people may vote Mr. Trump. Let's start from that. Mr. Trump is very, of course, unpredictable, and sometimes very, how can I say, disruptive. But at the same time, when we look back the first term, thanks to Mr. Trump's pressure, all U.S. allies in NATO and Asia have realized that we cannot keep cheap riding or free riding or cheap riding on U.S. security umbrella, and have significantly started to increase the defense budget. Japan decided to double defense budget from 2022 to 2027. So in a way, Trump shock halfway functioned quite well so far. And also, second reason, this is only two reasons. Second reason is that Mr. Trump basically wants to make you America great again. So I'm sure that he's a transactional, and also as I said, he may make some deal with the great power, other great powers at the expense of U.S. allies, but if he persists with that notion that America have to be great, maybe it could be a last resort that Mr. Trump will not make a catastrophic decision to weaken the U.S. leadership in the future. So maybe that is two reasons why. But the 70% Harris, because obviously she's more, we can expect more consistency, and also, of course, she is likely to make much of U.S. alliance network, and Japan and also US other allies in the US is already committed to invest more for security. And in that context, Harris is good. And also, lastly, most importantly, when I look at today's presidential debate, there was a Q&A on Russian invasion to Ukraine. And Vice President Harris categorically said that we have to win. We have to defeat Russia. But Mr. Trump said we have to finish. He want to finish the war. So I think that finishing a war by potentially forcing Ukraine to compromise on some part of territory could lead to a more catastrophic scenario in long run. So that is another reason why I think Harris is more favorable. Thank you.
Natalie, who are Australians voting for?
Oh, Anthony, I was going to go with Indonesia. Look, I think it really depends in the Australian context. You know, if you're more, as Hiro mentioned just now, if with Trump's anti-woke agenda, if you're of an ultra-conservative persuasion, then you might find someone like Trump more palatable. You may find a strongman figure more palatable. If you're more on the progressive side, you may look for a Harris leadership. I think if I am going to skip to the region, though, I think because it's important to talk about the extent to which this is looked at from a regional perspective and how hard it's generalized. So just quickly picking up Indonesia as an example, looking at Trump at the potential, again, as I said earlier, for economic opportunities, bolstering, the prospect of jobs for a large population, a very young population as well. But at the same time, the growing discontent with the current president and the ways in which laws and the Constitution have been manipulated. So potentially a Harris presidency that might promote democracy, human rights, and anti-corruption could equally be appealing. So it's not such a clear-cut answer, I think, but I think the number one issue for certain countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, would be the way in which the United States handles the ongoing conflict and bloodshed in Gaza, certainly.
Finally, Harsh, how is India voting?
So let's start with Kamala Harris, who's of Indian origin. Her mother was from India. In 2019, when she came onto center stage, she was one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for presidency. This was greeted with a great amount of interest and even euphoria in India. Even some villages, around the area that her mother actually belonged to, that had, idols of her in temples. So obviously there was a great amount of interest, and you can imagine that one of our own would had the possibility of assuming the most important position in the United States of America. So that was the feeling behind it. But as time passed, that interest seems to have waned. I was reading an interesting article in the Washington Post, a recent one, in which it said essentially that as her presidential contest draws closer, India seems to view her differently, more muted in terms of her connection, but also uncertain about her strategic stand on India. I would look at it differently. I would say that, she's a politician. She understands that, in America, to be identified with as a person of African American origin is far more important from a vote bank perspective than to be identified from an Indian origin perspective. And I think that's perfectly understandable. Of course, she hasn't visited India. That's one factor. She spoke in today's debate about the fact that she toured the world, but that did not include a stopover in India. So there's less familiarity from that perspective also. But she'd have a lot of people who would vote for her simply because of what would appear to be a more sympathetic consideration of issues such as women and children, issues of relating to immigration, healthcare, education. So there would be a lot of people who would see her from that perspective and would be inclined to support her if they had the vote. On the other hand, Trump is a known commodity in India. Now, I was in the United States when we had this famous event called Howdy Modi, when Prime Minister Modi and President Trump jointly addressed an audience of 50,000 Indian Americans in Houston, Texas. And that event was the most televised event in India. Trump was seen in every household in India. And in 2020, Trump visited India, and he was greeted, he received a tumultuous welcome. There were 100,000 people in that stadium, that one stadium, to listen to him speak. And I think he got a sort of welcome that he'd never had, I mean, possibly never had even in the United States. So essentially, Trump is known in India, but also many of his policies, and because he is known, his policy has been seen as favorable, pushing back on an assertive China, keeping geopolitical balance, inclined to engage on a free trade agreement. And for a lot of Indians, his recent statement that Indian students studying in America could be eligible for the green card came as a major boost. But Trump has one more Indian origin trump card, which is Usha Chilikuri Vance, the wife of Senator J.D. Vance, is of Indian origin. So he's got that also behind him. But I would say that irrespective of who wins, I would say, in the sense that from an Indian perspective, I think there would be clearly support for both candidates. And as far as governments are concerned, governments are agnostic. But I think the government here can sit back and be quite content about the fact that whether it is Donald Trump or whether it is Kamala Harris, the relationship would continue to receive the sort of attention that previous presidencies have given it. So we are pretty agnostic about how it is. But certainly, I think both would get a pretty good vote, and it's similar margins that you'd see in the United States, I would say, in general.
So we're just waiting for our colleagues to come back online. But in the meantime, I think we have capacity to keep going with the conversation. One of the questions that I think that we were to discuss as well is the extent to which that our respective countries might meet a second Trump administration with some trepidation. And in this case, if we could go around and perhaps talk about what has your country's experience been with the first Trump administration? What are perhaps the main takeaways? Debra, do you want to start off with that, please?
I mean, I think the Trump administration from 2016 to 2020 just marked this collapse in U.S.-China relations that nobody saw coming, and was greatly almost traumatizing. So this, Trump's reorientation to great power competition sort of caught people by surprise, and, has persisted to this day, as we can see. Meanwhile, there was also a bypassing of multilateral organizations like the WTO in favor of tariffs and forms of unilateral pressure that, again, was not expected and quite disappointing. And then there was a bypassing of China on other global issues, like, dealing with the North Korea issue. All of a sudden, Trump and Kim Jong-un were meeting without the consultations that would have happened in the past. So China had to deal with that by sort of stepping up, and there was a suspension of funds for the WHO that, China then had to pony up the money to ensure that the World Health Organization was funded, tided over. And so we're still kind of dealing with the aftermath of everything that happened in the Trump administration, and that since then continued by the Biden administration. And we can see that some of that, the hangover is affecting Chinese domestic policy to this day. So we can see, for example, from the recent third plenum that a lot of the industrial policy is almost in response to all of these external shocks that sort of began during Trump's first term.
And I think Natalie picked up the question as we dropped off here, picked up the moderating as we dropped off there. So thank you, thank you, Natalie, for picking up the moderation. Look, I want to actually now open the floor to take some questions. We've got a few questions coming in online. So in the last kind of 15 or 20 minutes we've got left, I want to take some of those questions. I want to start here in Melbourne. Does anybody have a question that asks? Wait till you get the microphone. Raise your hand. Yes, just down the front here.
Hi. Hello. I'm from Taiwan, so I'll go straight with the question that's related to Taiwan, I guess. So I want to know what's the perspective or the concern from your regional countries on the impact of China-Taiwan issue post US election. Thank you.
And given the time, we won't go around to everyone. Let's ask you, Hiro.
I was expecting that you will ask me to answer this question. Yes, Taiwan issue is one of the biggest concern if Mr. Trump become a president again, because his recent remark at the Bloomberg interview, I think it was last month, he said that Taiwan should pay for its defense. And also he said, it is not first time, but he said that Taiwan had stolen the semiconductor industry from US. So that highlighted his perception of Taiwan, that Taiwan is semiconductor industry semiconductor competitor, and Taiwan is a kind of like a security burden. So in that, under that perception, I wonder if how much extent will Mr. Trump help or devote its security commitment to Taiwan in time of contingency to defend Taiwan. And Japan is very, very close, geographically very close to Taiwan. So if there were to be a war between China and Taiwan, whether Japan will, like or not, Japan will maybe get entangled. So that is the one point. But also, shortly, Mr. Trump, on the contrary to Mr. Trump's individual perception, I'm sure that the Trump team will have more strategists, like kind of hawkish strategists, like former Secretary of State Pompeo or National Security Advisor Mr. O'Brien, and those people will make much of the geopolitical importance of Taiwan. So I would like to see how those advisors will persuade Mr. Trump to commit to the security or stability of Taiwan Strait. Thank you.
Harsh, we have a question from India, and it's on American immigration policy. The question is, how do you think the US presidential election will affect immigration policies, given the huge number of immigrants in the US from around the world, and obviously an issue that comes up in the Indian context? We've seen a large Indian community in the US.
So, when it comes to India, we have a couple of issues. One, of course, is that, we believe that, there should be routes opened up for legal migration. In other words, you have to have greater access for people who serve your interests, whether you need professionals, whether you need skilled workers, whether you need people in certain sectors. Those people should be allowed to come in. And obviously, we have no issue with tighter controls on illegal immigration. And one of the issues that is very important for India is the issue of the green card, because there's a 7% cap on every country for green cards, whereas 80 or 90% of those applying for green cards are from India. I mean, a very large percentage is from India. So we want those caps to be removed. So we want a more sympathetic consideration there. And so, both candidates have spoken about this issue, and I think both candidates in general obviously want to look at how to stem illegal immigration, but I think not enough thought has been given as to how you can, provide an impetus for legal migration, because that is something that every country, especially given the demographics, would need to look at, and would need to, a country like America, which is based on migration, will have to have a policy that facilitates legal migration. Here, I think Trump's remark, and this is not too long back, maybe a month or two ago, when he said that Indian students, but he didn't qualify it. He said those students studying in the United States really should have access to the green card. Whether he meant that those students who were doing postgrad or whether those students who were an H-1B visa would get green cards was not clear, but it came as a shot in the arm. And it also tended to indicate that he had a sympathetic consideration when it came to, concerns that reflect Indian interests. So I would certainly say that both candidates really need to provide more detail before we can, on immigration, on legal migration, before we can really take a call on who has a better alternative. Right now, I think the options are not very good because both sides are looking at illegal immigration and not legal migration, which we believe is very important. So here's where it is, and I hope my friend, my compatriot who was there, feels that this is an adequate answer for him. But really, there is a bit of lack of clarity on this as far as the candidates are concerned.
Debra, there's a question from online. I'm not quite sure where from, but a question we received, quite an interesting one I want to pose to you. What are the realistic prospects of US-China cooperation on either Gaza or Ukraine, given sensitivities about China's closer relations with Russia and with Israel's opponents in the Middle East? And how might I'll throw in, how might the election affect the potential for that cooperation?
So on the relationship, I think China still maintains that globally there's a misperception of where it stands in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Wang Yi in this last round of meetings was adamant that the idea that China is supportive of Russia is absolutely false, and that is sort of a false narrative being perpetrated. The fact that they sell components that can then be assembled for military purposes within Russia is not a situation that is particular to China. So I think China itself is optimistic in terms of the mediating role it can play in terms of bringing Russia and Ukraine to the table, as long as there is alignment from the United States. And so in terms of, between the two candidates, it appears that Trump is probably the more likely, if he were to win, that's a more likely scenario. What was the other part?
So, I think that's great. Let's move on. Natalie, a question here asking about China's approach to regional forums and particularly the Global South. So the question is, China's established another potential regional framework for developing countries, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS Initiative, and it's enhancing cooperation with emerging markets. What do you think? I mean, how is that being viewed in ASEAN, and how might the election affect or shape a potential US response to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I looked at the sort of tail end of the question. I talked about the US being left behind. I think I have to bring us back to that desire in Southeast Asia for a lot of the rhetoric talking about the options of Southeast Asian countries to drop the binary use, the idea of competition, the idea that the United States is losing. The only winners that should be in Southeast Asia should be Southeast Asian states. And to that end, what Southeast Asian states needs are a menu of options. And as they see it right now, China is providing options. These may not be the best options across all domains, but Southeast Asian states, particularly Cambodia, where I was a couple of days ago talking to the Ministry of National Defense, who said to me in no uncertain terms, if China is providing options, we will look at any arrangement, any multilateral fora that is a contributor to a positive security environment in the Indo-Pacific. But it doesn't mean that the United States has been abandoned. It doesn't mean that the United States has stopped becoming a partner of choice in certain domains, such as security and certain economic areas. So I think, again, we have to take a holistic look at the way in which Southeast Asian states are looking at the options provided to them, and then see whether or not which administration, whether it's the Harris or the Trump administration, are providing options that actually marry up with the needs of Southeast Asian states, not just the needs that the Americans think that these countries need. So again, something like Biden's initiative for democracy, that has a lot of merit in terms of reinforcing certain democratic ideals in the country. Countries like Thailand, where the youth really wants there to be robust, fair and free elections, amongst other things. But is that something that all Southeast Asian states are looking for? Is that a priority? Is that something that other states are providing? Those are the kinds of more granular, more specific analyses I think that needs to be done. But first and foremost is understanding that Southeast Asian states will pursue a multitude of options, and that does not necessarily look like a zero-sum game for the United States.
I'm going to take a question from the floor here in Melbourne again, up the back. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm interested in the future of the AUKUS agreement with the potential of a Trump victory. I know in the past he hasn't sort of had the most commitment to prearranged multilateral agreements. I know Malcolm Turnbull's spoken about that he had difficulty negotiating with him on such matters. So I know AUKUS is a lot bigger than sort of the deals that they were talking about. But yeah, I'm interested in sort of whether that would hold under Trump. I mean, I guess it's unpredictable, but yeah, just your best thoughts.
I think that's definitely a question for you, Natalie.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Look, I've given that a bit of thought about what the potential scenarios might be. And given Trump's rather business acumen, his disposition, is there a potential scenario under which Australia would be asked to contribute even more financially to AUKUS? So again, is there a potential of looking at what other options might be, a fallback plan if AUKUS becomes unwieldy, or are there enough elements of buffer in the agreement where the agreement would be insulated from those kinds of whims? I would hope that the very deep institutionalized ties and dialogues that we have between our Department of Defense and the Pentagon would allow for enough communication to say that it's not in the United States' interest to put this kind of pressure on one of its closest and most loyal alliance partners. So that's what I would be relying on, the strength of those people-to-people ties, those institutional links, track 1, track 1.5, track 2 type dialogues, and that would insulate the relationship from perhaps Trump waking up one day and asking for a couple of extra $1 billion. But yeah, we'll see what happens.
Hiro, we have a question here on the future of the Quad. Given the prospect of a return of President Trump, what do you think the future of the quadrilateral security dialogue will be, and will Japan be happy for the US taking the lead?
Thank you very much. In short, I'm sure that Quad will survive, whichever candidate will become a president. Quad evolved during Trump administration. As I remember, they have a first ministerial meeting under Trump, and also Biden inherited a Quad framework and further enhanced. So geopolitical environment will define the function and prospect of Quad, and the geopolitical reality will never change. So I think it will survive and also further strengthen. But one challenge is that Russia. So after all, India wants to maintain a good relation both with Russia and China. But Japan and US and Australian relations with Russia have been deteriorating after Russian aggression to Ukraine, and it will keep deteriorating. So so in that context, Quad is basically the area that Quad can focus on would be limited. Not global, but maybe limited to the domain mainly related to China. So that is a challenge, I think. If China, India, and Japan, US, Australia's stance over the Russia will the gap between them will get wider and wider. Maybe there will be a more limitation that Quad framework could do. But so far, US and Japan, Australia are aware that India's reality that they have to rely on Russian weaponaries, and also they don't want to alienate Russia to maintain good balance of power vis-a-vis China. So far, it is okay. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's always the way with these things. If you were just starting to get warmed up, and we could talk all night, but unfortunately, we are going to have to bring the conversation online and here in the Melbourne headquarters to a close. I think you'll agree with me. It's been a fascinating little taste of perspectives from Asia on the election. All we have to do now is to await the result on the 7th of November. And then we can do another one of these and we can talk about, well, what does the result mean for Asia? Obviously, as is often the case, these events finish with an advertisement. So the Asia Society Policy Institute, which is Asia Society's think tank, will be publishing a compendium on the US election and its impact on Asia policy. And that'll be out online on the 2nd of October. So keep a lookout for that. That'll have a great selection of perspectives from the region on what the US election means for a range of countries in Asia. So it now just remains for me to thank all of our panelists tonight. Debra in Hong Kong, Natalie in Australia, but actually in Malaysia at the moment, Harsh in India, and Hiroyuki in Japan. So please join me here in Melbourne in giving the panelists an applause. And if you're online, you can give them an applause wherever you are.